Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and joining me today once more is Amber Rahim Shamsi. Those of you who've been tuning in or follow Pakistani news are familiar with Amber. She's an award-winning journalist and was on the podcast as the first guest in 2022 on season 3, essentially, which is what we're on, because both she and I agreed that this year politics is going to dominate the economy. We're more than halfway through the year, and that's exactly what's happened. And I was listening to the podcast I did with Amber at that point in time ahead of this discussion. And she said something very interesting, that Pakistani politics is dysfunctional and it's almost like everyone's on psychedelics. And I think, Amber, you were on point with that. And we talked about whether the PDM or the PML-N had a plan, and people should go listen to that episode as well, just to see how on point on many of the things Amber was. Of course, none of us anticipated the vote of no confidence, but we had talked about that the fact that will Imran Khan easily go away if he's pushed out and things like that. And clearly, much of those scenarios have played out. So today we're going to talk to Amber about what's happening, what's next. Of course, yesterday, the Supreme Court said that Hamza was no longer chief minister. So we're recording this podcast the day after that happened. And we still are not clear, at least I am not clear, on what the strategy for the PDM, especially the PML-N, is going to be. So Amber, thank you once again for joining us, and welcome once again to Pakistonomy.
My pleasure, Uzair, but I will say that we're sort of nearly over the halfway line to the year, and I'm frankly exhausted. Politics has been exhausting. The economy has been exhausting. And frankly, I'm sick of the rain in Karachi as well.
And neither the IMF has approved the program, and nor have we had elections. So we're both exhausted, but there's still a lot of action to come, so to speak. But tell us, what's going on? What have you been observing? And while politics has been dominating everything else, is there light at the end of the tunnel? And if so, is that another train about to hit us? Or is it truly we're going to be out of the tunnel anytime soon?
So I think the big question now mid-year, and it was actually a question at the beginning of the year when I spoke to you as well, is when will Pakistan have its next election? And there are 3 or 4, I think, who or what will determine that is some of the questions that we would need to ask in order to find answers. So is it going to be Imran Khan and the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, who after yesterday's Supreme Court decision removing Hamza and the by-elections before that, is actually in a position of power at the moment, has more cards in his hand, and he's obviously been advocating for early elections. And I want to sort of remind viewers as well that at the time when the vote of no confidence was being held, there were secret negotiations between, or at least an attempt at that time, that Imran Khan, when he was prime minister, he was trying to use back channels through the military to talk to the opposition at that time, with an offer, which is, let's hold fresh elections, don't present the vote of no confidence against me. And that did not happen because the opposition parties at that time were determined to go ahead. So, so we're back where the same question, which is when will the next elections be? Imran Khan has the upper hand at the moment, given that he has a government in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in the north, as well as Punjab, which is very, very key, which is considered a bellwether province, if you will. Nearly half Pakistan's population, key to government in the federation as well. So, he has more of the cards at the moment. I would like to differentiate between PDM and the current National Unity or Coalition government, because the PDM comprises Maulana Fazlur Rahman, the JUF head is, he's a chairperson of that. But PML-N is the other big key player. The ANP, the Awami National Party, which is, a Pashtun left-wing party based largely in KP, exited along with the Pakistan People's Party. So let's be clear that let's not call them PDM, let's just call them a national coalition or coalition government. So the PDM has been resisting calls, and the question of when the next election should be came up a couple of times in the few months that they have been in government. Most crucially, when they had the upper hand, which was just after the victory of the vote of no confidence. Shehbaz Sharif was elected as prime minister. The Imran Khan government was still unpopular. So they had the cards at that time. They could have called for fresh elections and they chose not to. And the question at that time, and you've been waiting for the IMF deal to happen, so have I, because the question at that time was, well, will a caretaker sign off on it? There needs to be some kind of continuity. What are the options? Should the unity government, in particular, when we think of unity government, though, is that because the PML-N has a prime minister, finance minister, these key ministries respond, the Ministry of Petroleum as well, key ministries that seem to have been responsible for the political backlash that we'll talk about as well. But the decision at that time was the PDM as well as the Pakistan People's Party would continue, take those tough decisions, and really just continue until next year. And they're very, very sort of, and these decisions happened, if you remember, the entire sort of close cabinet, including Shehbaz Sharif, flew to London, met with the PML-N Supremo, Nawaz Sharif, had a chit chat. There was a lot of criticism. It was like, well, this government is just formed. Why are they flying off to London to consult with Nawaz Sharif? But, there it is. And the decision, again, after much back and forth, was we will continue. The Pakistan People's Party has also insisted that this current dispensation needs to continue.
On that, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
On the trip to London, I don't know what you've heard, but I've heard conflicting stories about the fact that Nawaz had pushed for elections. They had agreed at that time, Shehbaz and company, with Nawaz's instruction. And by the time they landed in Islamabad, the decision was changed. And then Nawaz was like, you do what you want and don't come to me. Is that true? Because something I've heard, and I don't know if you've heard something similar about this as well.
So it has been clear that Nawaz Sharif has not been in favor of continuation. He's expressed his dissatisfaction. There's been, murmurings and disgruntlement, if you will. And I would say that's also interesting that after the kind of the decision by the Supreme Court to maintain that, Pervez Elahi remains as chief minister, I think Nawaz Sharif's disgruntlement, I could actually hear it in his voice, his, grandfatherly boomer uncle voice as well, and to use Urdu here, ye kya tamasha hai, what circus is this, and that kind of thing. But, those have continued. It is really helped, the Pakistan People's Party has continued. Actually, I think they've been very constant in that. Whereas you see the division with the PML-N about continuation. Shehbaz Sharif, I think, was some of the mistakes that he made was, bringing Hamza as chief minister. That was, again, I think, just in terms of optics, has played very badly. To have a father and son, both at the center as well as in Punjab. I think just in terms of responsibility, they made some decisions that obviously proved very unpopular, which was a petrol subsidy, removing it slowly, and you could speak better about this, but increasing petrol prices, not thinking that they would have to bear the political costs. So I think these questions, or when the elections will be held, I don't think that the current national unity government really has a lot of cards in its stack at the moment. The other, obviously, I think the economy, is that going to determine whether the next elections are held or not? We're still waiting for that IMF deal. We're still waiting for that money. Now it's going to be in August. Let's see. Or are we waiting for the army or the military establishment? Or I would say now, with the Supreme Court decision as well, that we need to not just call it the military establishment. Let's go back to calling it the establishment, because that includes bureaucrats and the judiciary, right? So is it going to be determined by the establishment? Is it going to be determined by the army chief appointment? These are all questions I think that are really important and now being debated as well. At the moment, just as we speak, elections seem to be on the horizon, but again, you never know.
That's fascinating, and I think your point on the political cost that they've bared, right, on especially with petroleum price increases. From the time we spoke on this podcast in January to today, the rupee has slid over 30%, right? So it was roughly 180 at that time. Now it's at 240, and good luck if you can find it at 240, right? It's not even available at that rate in the open market. And that reminds me of, like, the tale of the king and his sly advisor who told the king that if we blind everybody in the kingdom, we can rule because we will only be the ones with eyesight. And it turns out that wasn't that great advice because once the kingdom's people, the subjects were blind, they basically, a mob came outside the palace and killed the king and the advisor. And before the king was killed, he asked the advisor what's going on, and he said the people think we're possessed by demons because we are the only ones who claim eyesight and no one else can see. So they think we're like some crazy demons that have come to rule over them, so they'll kill us. And that reminds me of like this particular, just Pakistani politicians in general, but the PDM or the opposition at that time that was opposed to Imran Khan, because they used to berate him over things like the slide of the dollar or the hike in petroleum prices or the taxes they had to collect in petroleum, right? And there was always like petrol bomb, which has been with us for years before Imran Khan as well. And then to expect that we will come to power and then do the same things, and that won't hurt us politically because the people will understand that we have to make tough decisions, was a bit like outlandish, to say the least. And they've paid the price for that as well. But from your point of view, my question was like, how big of a dent has sort of the narrative taken? Is it purely, or from your point of view, is it mainly driven by these tough choices that they've had to make and the inflation that has been unleashed? Or do you think also that the voter in Punjab, the core PML-N voter, which obviously was energized by Nawaz Sharif's rhetoric of vote ko izzat do, and now we see Khan has taken on that same narrative as well and co-opted it essentially. Was the voter disappointed with this as well? Because in our podcast, we talked about this is all about the selection and the military establishment, which at least since 1998-99 wanted Shehbaz in Islamabad. This is documented in various books, including Naseem Zehra's Fantastic From Kargil to the Coup. They finally had their selection. They got their blue-eyed boy Shehbaz Sharif in Islamabad. And so I'm wondering, what do you think about this, this decline in political capital from tough choices, but also the fact that their voters saw through it and said, you know what, like I'm sick and tired of you striking a deal. When you talk about vote ko izzat do, I actually want you to stand by it, and I'm not going to stand by you if you go back on that.
Okay, I mean, I wish there were more exit polls, so I had statistics and facts to back this up. But given that, there's been a lot of discussion as well as reporters on the ground, spoken to people, I think a few things are pretty clear. A few things, one of the things is that Shehbaz's reputation as an efficient administrator and a better governor has taken a hit. And while we could, people who look at the economy seriously, like you, would say, well, there's no other choice but to take back the petrol subsidy. That's responsible. You can't really sell it to a public that's already been beaten by inflation and other things for a couple of years. And when you've obviously, as you pointed out, been selling the rhetoric that whether it's the petrol price, the IMF-led budget, all of those things, we're going to make it better.
And just for the audience, from a statistical perspective, because I've been looking at that data, since 2019 and before this price hike and this new wave of inflation in Pakistan was 40+% in cumulative terms, versus 20% in India and Bangladesh. So yes, you're absolutely right that Main Street was not in a mood to bear more inflation after 40+% inflation in 3 years.
Absolutely. And let's also bear in mind that inflation, the global recession, supply shocks, Russia, Ukraine, it's hitting economies and politics everywhere. Look at Italy, where the Prime Minister just resigned. Look at what, for instance, the tussle between the two Tory contenders in the UK. They're talking about tax cuts versus minimum tax cuts, inflation, cost of living. Look at Joe Biden, worried about the midterms and obviously his popularity. So it isn't just the current dispensation or Imran Khan before this current dispensation. So obviously this was a big election issue. And you saw that, for instance, I was looking at the numbers in terms of the turnout. So you have some more statistics. Imran Khan not just was able to energize his base because he launched this very aggressive campaign, in terms of a series of rallies, social media, interviews with favorite influencers and media personalities and anchors. We could criticize it all alike, but that blitzkrieg was really effective as well. Whereas because the PML-N and the National Unity Government, what was their narrative is the question. What was their propaganda machine? Nobody's going to buy a responsible statecraft when you see that your grocery bills are impacted and you really can't pay for some of the things that you were used to paying for. Obviously the first cuts that you get are schooling and health. So people's lives were difficult. So you really can't switch over from that. So let's just say that in every, I think there was the turnout for a by-election. Just bear in mind, by-elections were on those 20 seats that the MPAs from PTI, because they defected, they voted for Hamza Shehbaz. The Supreme Court had said that those votes can't be counted. And then obviously there's going to be a by-election on them. So there are 20 seats. These seats in 2018 went to about 11 were PTI's PTI candidates, and then about 9 were independents that were later joined the PTI afterwards through Jahangir Khan Tareen and his, magic jet plane. But besides that, I mean, there was a increase in turnout around 14%. Now, a lot of people are saying this could be the turnout was obviously because Imran Khan energized his base, played the victim card, played the religion card, played the conspiracy card. It doesn't really matter. It was effective. It worked. At the same time, you had inflation. There was a little bit of disillusionment. This could have meant that the PML-N voter might have kept away. We also know that there was a lot of infighting on the awarding of tickets to PML-N. So a lot of the old guard or loyalists who had gotten PML-N tickets were opposed in certain constituencies. And then broadly, if we talk about the sort of national propaganda machine, the PML-N had really sort of positioned itself as anti-establishment, as you pointed out a little before as well. They couldn't say that anymore. They couldn't sell that anymore. Maryam Nawaz obviously was thrown in because she's obviously a crowd puller. She pulled a few crowds, but really, again, when people are crushed by inflation and you see that the Shehbaz Sharif for PML-N has sort of has flip-flopped on the anti-establishment narrative, that kind of victim card, that kind of the sort of naming of military chiefs and serving officers' names that Nawaz Sharif memorably did in Gujranwala in 2019. And then where we are, where Imran Khan has taken up that mantle and has just run with it. And it's a far more effective social media team and has done it in different ways. I think where Nawaz Sharif sort of planted the seeds, I think Imran Khan sort of nurtured and growed it. So I think that these were a few factors that you could see were responsible for PML-N's defeat. And while PML-N might sort of spit and say, well, none of these were our seats to begin with, we increased our voter sort of count as well, it doesn't really matter. Perception is that, and we can see that how it was borne out in terms of the election or, of Parvez Elahi and subsequently the Supreme Court judgment as well, where perception is now that Imran Khan is ascendant. His blitzkrieg has succeeded. The current dispensation is has paid that political cost, and that's really it. So I think sort of let's see where the next few months goes. I mean, I think now we're looking at August as sort of key in terms of the IMF tranche. There's been a lot of talk about default and how default is not inevitable, and I know again you'd speak better about it. But I think, at the moment, the current sort of ruling government is in trouble. It's in trouble because it really doesn't have a counter narrative or propaganda to sell. There's talk about they may impose Governor Raj in Punjab, which, for people who don't know what Governor Raj is, essentially that you declare an emergency and that the governor takes back executive powers from the chief minister, except the problem is that it's not really possible post 2010 or post the 18th Amendment, just because you need the provincial assembly to, sort of sign off on it. And the provincial assembly is at the moment, obviously, chief minister is Parvez Elahi, and the numbers are really thin for the PML-N and the ruling coalition. You've just had there's one contested seat from the by-election in Rawalpindi. You also have one MPA who's been disqualified because of, I think, his degree or something like that. So the numbers are really thin. You still have, obviously, a speaker election to come as well. So, I mean, there's a I think they're on really thin ground here in terms of Governor Raj grasping at straws, really. Mariam Nawaz, who is, you could say, again, the crowd puller, represents Nawaz Sharif and that school of thought, which is, we need to be more aggressive, and that's what she's advocating. Whereas her uncle, Shahbaz Sharif, tends to be, has a softer approach, is a bridge between Pindi, is considered to be a bridge between Pindi and PML-N, more conciliatory, cannot do that kind of sort of aggressive, hit you in the face kind of politics that sort of works at rallies and the stumps that Imran Khan does, that Mariam Nawaz does. So really, I think the PML-N, especially more so than the Pakistan People's Party, is between a rock and a hard place at the moment. Yeah, we're now waiting until August for the next twist and turn. And actually, before August even, because I think at the moment we have a speaker election that has to come in the Punjab Assembly. And now what will Imran Khan do next is another question in order to sort of prompt elections. And what will the military establishment do in order to prompt elections? So, lots of questions.
And on top of that, Khan, in my view, also has to convince Pervez Elahi to be a two-day, so to speak, chief minister. My question has been, what if Pervez Elahi says no, like we're going through August next year? What does Khan do at that point, right? So that would also be interesting because it's not that cut and dry. Like we know that Pervez Elahi has his own issues with Imran Khan, and Imran Khan has his own issues with Pervez Elahi. So that will be another sort of subplot, so to speak, in this larger scheme of things. Coming back to the central plot here, right? Obviously, historically, if you look at Pakistan, like the mid-90s, 1993 is like something that's fresh in my mind, because at that time, there was this political saga between the prime minister and the president. They reached a standoff, and General Kakar sort of was the guarantor and took resignations from both of them together and then held elections, and that brought Benazir back to power, right, as we know it. At this point, General Bajwa is not capable of being a guarantor. He's essentially a lame duck, and he doesn't have credibility, any credibility. But in 2007, then, if we look at it, Musharraf faced a similar situation, and he pushed Kayani as his successor. We kind of knew that he was coming in, running the ISI, and that, Kayani would manage the transition. We don't have that either. In this situation, how do we reach an off-ramp when the key central player in this, like, yes, you said establishment is broader than the military, but the military establishment is at the core, is in this instance especially. How do they act when, in fact, we know there's an internal divide within the institution? Khan will obviously not be okay with Bajwa running this election, so to speak, or guaranteeing this election, so to speak, as a quote-unquote neutral. He's also on his way out. There's no clarity on who his successor will be, but there are also still questions that he's technically open to one more year, right? Because that's the sort of if you read the legal sort of opinion on this, there's 3+1 is what people tell me, at least.
Actually, because it's based on age.
Yes.
So
where does the military stand in all of this, and how does it sort of function when its preeminent role in these crises has been the role of a guarantor, and now it's incapable of being that guarantor, primarily because its chief is a lame duck?
Yes. So the other question at the moment is that, look, I think there are two things here. Political legitimacy. That's been a question that's been, I think, that's been plaguing and is responsible for much of the political uncertainty that you've seen in the last few years, which is since 2018. Imran Khan did not have political legitimacy. He's admitted as much in several interviews, right? In many different ways. He's hinted at it, or he said it directly as well.
Most famous one of them being that he was like, we used to get blackmailed by our coalition allies and have to call the ISI to get us the votes. He's clearly said that.
He's clearly said that. He's also sort of Qazi Faiz Issa. He's also dumped it on the military establishment as well, Justice Qazi Faiz Issa as well. So in many ways, political legitimacy was a problem for Imran Khan, and it is a problem for the current dispensation, because it really is just a continuation. These current assemblies are actually. So I think in that sense, Imran Khan is right. Unfortunately, you can only get political legitimacy if you have a free and fair election with a neutral, and I use the word right now, with an independent, let's just say independent election commission of Pakistan, and an actually neutral umpire. That is where the military establishment stays out of political affairs, as well as I think, given the last few months, I remember we talked about judicial politics at the top of the year. Have assumed even more importance in the last few months. So it requires everybody to sort of confirm to their constitutional role. Who's going to do that? Who is doing that? We've had lots of talk about a soft intervention, which frankly, I'm not even sure if I can say this, seems, slightly, no, I can't even say it, but it's such an odd thing. I think it's only in Pakistan, going back to the whole theme of psychedelic, it's just only in Pakistan can you sort of come up with that kind of terminology, soft intervention. What the heck does that even mean? And there now people are asking whether yesterday's decision was a soft intervention, because we have to remember that
it's like, I mean, if I were to put it politely, it's like saying, Purane zamane mein, like my mother, if I misbehaved, would smack me with a belan, right? Like as she's cooking, or with a spatula that's hot. But in modern terms, modern mothers put you in a timeout, right? So it's like that. It's like, oh, you're misbehaving, I'll put you in a timeout. I'll count till 10. If you don't start behaving, you're going in a timeout. Belan is out, but that's the soft intervention now.
That's a soft intervention. So and none of these really key institutions seem to be behaving within, coloring within the line, so to speak, right? Who is the arbiter? Who is the guarantor at this point in time? As I mentioned, Imran Khan tried a few months ago, and then, he went all out, talk about Mr. X and Y, as well as, Mir Jafar and Mir Sadiq and all of those things. At the same time, obviously, it's clear that the PML-N still doesn't have the full trust of the military establishment. And it's really, you've seen from numerous judgments that nor does it find favor within certain parts of the judicial establishment either. Yesterday, President Arif Alvi spoke about, for instance, the President House or using his offices as or his, as with civil society, with lawyers, and I think it's interesting where now you're going from the military establishment to civil society, and I don't know how you decide which ragtag group would be a guarantor and arbiter between various political factions and parties in order to guarantee a free and fair election. I think we're just running out of ideas.
And for those who, your reference to the president and his engagement, for those who may not know, because we're getting into the weeds, they put a trial balloon out saying if there is, a successor to Bajwa announced before ahead of time, that may not be such a bad thing. So it's like almost like that Kayani playbook, like announce your successor and we'll deal with him, not you.
And then he went back on it. There's a statement coming from the president. He said, well, we didn't really mean it. I didn't really mean it exactly that way. But I think because everybody knows the key right now is November, who's going to be the new army chief. Imran Khan has indicated that he didn't really want Faiz, who is currently the Corps Commander Peshawar, was former DGISI, in which his reappointment as DGISI and the appointment of the ISI chief was really sort of, if you think about it, we spoke about this in January as well, which is where things started to unravel very quickly for the Imran Khan government. At that time, I was still unsure whether this would result in the split that we saw in March and April, but I guess clearly it was a bigger split than I had calculated. But the point being that, does Bajwa come back? There are obviously, as you mentioned as well, there's been lots of talk about how he might want to come back, he may not want to come back. There is clearly a split within the military establishment as well, support for Imran Khan versus, I would say, neutrality. I think it's also interesting where the DGI-SPR had to make several statements in order to dispel rumors of the American conspiracy. And I think many people saw that as the army establishment really being as neutral as it could possibly be at that time. But my question at that time was, is this tactical neutrality or strategic neutrality? Clearly, one can see that it was tactical. It was suited at that time. So much of the inflation, much of the brickbats, or much of the political costs that the current dispensation, in particular the PML-N, is paying for the price for, does not go back to the military establishment because it's not openly supporting the current political government coalition. So win-win for the military establishment. However, who is going to get to decide the next army chief? One of the questions is, could it be a caretaker? You know, so I'm not sure if I have answers to some of these questions. I think with Pakistani politics, you're left with more questions than answers, to be honest.
And I have a more radical proposal on the next chief or how chiefs are selected. My view is the prime minister should just say, I don't get to pick, just like the justices pick their own based on seniority or whatever. You go to your corps commanders and pick your own successor. Insert a bit of political chaos within the institution, because it does help the institution from the quote unquote the establishment's dominance, because the prime minister gets to select a chief, and then so the corps commanders sort of have some level of consensus or agreement or unity within them. But we clearly know there are divides in their politics within them. So let them figure it out on their own on who they want to, among the commanders, be their chief, and see how that plays out, right? Of course, it's a radical proposal. It's preposterous. It will insert all sort of chaos within the institution itself. But I half jokingly say it because it's like, if the military is going to continue intervening in politics, then it's the politician's job to also then say, you know what, we wash our hands clean of it, select your own chief and see how that plays out for you, right? It's like, it's one of those things as well. But speaking of
no harm in some offering radical solutions, because after yesterday's decision as well, there was Faratullah Babar, who was very close to Asif Ali Zardari, who's also a senator, very close to powerful circles, which is the Pakistan People's Party, is progressive and left-wing, and was close to Asif Ali Zardari during the 2008-2013 government as well, has proposed that it's finally time to that Parliament has more control over judicial appointments as well. So it's a season of radical solutions.
Yeah, and for sure we should discuss that, because clearly the 2007-8 compact is torn to shreds. So we don't know what comes next, and you have to figure that out. But speaking of guarantors, this is something I've been thinking about as well. Historically, Pakistan has had, as we talked, the military establishment becomes a guarantor in these crises. Externally, there have been two major guarantors, the United States and Saudi Arabia. China more so, but China operates sort of, doesn't really involve itself in these things as dramatically as the Saudis and the Americans have in the past. But they're also disinterested and disengaged, right? So it's like in Benazir meeting in the UAE with Condi sort of brokering the dialogue and all of that. We all know that's part of history. That's not happening. And my read on this has been that even you mentioned the IMF several times, well, we still need 4 to 5 billion from China and the Saudis combined and the Emiratis combined, right? Let's say it's these three countries that would provide the gap that's still there after the IMF. They, from my read, has been, would not want to overtly give that money because it may be seen as supporting the PDM at this instance or somebody, So they're also like a bit neutral because they don't want to put themselves in a position where Khan or somebody else will say, oh, you supported them and not me, right? And so we're seeing that hesitancy play out, and that's having an economic impact. But are you seeing any sort of like openings where external actors may just be like, hey guys, you need to figure this out because you're an important country to the region? Or is it all because of the end of the war in Afghanistan, they're just like, we don't really care what you do, just get your act together?
I mean, my sense here is that all these actors that we've mentioned that have, as you mentioned, played key roles. Even if you think about it, Qatar had a sort of key role in the Panama case with Nawaz Sharif, and then the letter that was produced, as well as Saudi Arabia, as well as US. It's Afghanistan is a story that is now over for much of the world. And it's really tragic to see that, given the continuing humanitarian crisis there. Pakistan, as you well know, is obviously trying to negotiate, and General Faiz, Peshawar Corps Commander, has been a sort of key interlocutor, as well as many clerics from Pakistan as well just went, and really nothing is happening on that front. But the point here is that Afghanistan and Pakistan, or AFPAC as it used to see, I think that story is pretty much over. Everybody's moved. Everybody's most concerned about energy, Russia, Ukraine. The story is shifted elsewhere. I remember very clearly as well, as a journalist, so much interest post 9/11 in this region, and then the shift to a post-Arab Spring, to the Middle East, and now it's Europe, as well as the energy crises. So I think the interest has waned as well. Friendly countries are also exhausted. They have their own concerns. They have other issues. I don't think anybody really wants to intervene openly or covertly at this point in time either. So just waiting and watching to see where Pakistan goes, or where the internal politics takes it. Where we have to deal with this mess ourselves, really, I think, as far as I'm concerned. And the problem at the moment is that there's so much distrust. I'm going to mention judicial or the politicization of the judiciary as well, because I think the distrust expressed by the coalition government on the judiciary is somewhat founded as well. Especially look at the judgment that came out yesterday that contradicted another judgment that was authored in part by the same judges. So the same bench hearing certain political cases, other judges, including a retired justice of the Supreme Court, has mentioned this as an issue as well, where these political cases are taken up by the same bench. There is no ideological variety. There is distrust within the judiciary as well. And obviously on the part of political parties, particularly the National Unity Government and its members at the moment, there is clearly a divide, or some divide within the military establishment. The political players are not willing or able to come to one table, just because right now it's pretty much about, it's a toss of the dice, right? I mean, it's a game that is about win or lose. It isn't about compromise. And I know a lot of people are talking about finding some kind of common economic agenda. But the question really is, what is the minimum economic agenda that can be agreed upon? Continuation of the IMF and those policies? I think every political party needs to have some kind of differentiated economic agenda in order to be different from one another, for instance. I think that really takes away from the beauty of democracy and the variety and diversity that you find within political parties and between political parties. So, I mean, that would be my question to you. Is there a minimum economic agenda that a lot of commentators have been talking about that political parties can agree on in order for Pakistan or the state to continue? That's a question I have for you, Uzair. I'm going to throw it back to you.
No, I don't think there can be one. And I think the reason for this is not that they can come to an agreement. I think it's an incentives mismatch, right? In a win or lose scenario, the way you've sort of articulated it, which is cutthroat, which is winner takes all, loser goes to jail or something else happens to them, right? Goes into oblivion, essentially. That's what they're both. It's a maximalist position, right? It's a maximalist fight. Now, in that fight, this is something I've been thinking about and sort of trying to wrap my head around is, if that is the political system that they're part of, then on the economic side, we have a country that has a gross financing need of $150 billion in the next 5 years, right? So it's abhi to sirf 4-5 billion mein halat kharab hai, right? It's 150. That's the cumulative figure. And yes, a lot of this will be met by aid that comes in, remittances, exports, but it's still roughly ballpark figure 20 to 25 billion gap over the next 5 years that we have to fill somehow, right? Let's assume that that's the ballpark. That situation requires whoever is in power to make very difficult, politically costly choices. Now, in a scenario where, even if we assume that go ahead.
No, I'm just going to sort of interject just with one thing. We've seen what happened to the PML-N once it made those difficult, costly choices as well. Who wants to be beaten, beaten to a pulp at the hustings, right? And go into a by-election, a local body election with that kind of reform-oriented agenda, or So I just want to point that out.
So again, that's what I was getting to, is that if the stakes are maximalist, and whoever comes to power has to make those tough choices, then whoever is in opposition, let's assume Imran Khan wins with a close to two-third majority. The PML-N is facing accountability and all sorts of things. The People's Party, the same thing. They're the two biggest rivals. And Imran Khan is going after them while doing the reforms that we're talking about. Then on the flip side, the incentive will be to undermine Imran Khan because you want to save yourself, right? Otherwise, you're screwed, essentially. So you will do the petrol bomb, Mehngai March type shenanigans that we've seen in the past because it's a game of survival, right? Now, if you're the PDM and you're trying to sort of fully neutralize the PTI, who you believe to be quote unquote fascist, I don't like that, the use of that term, but that's what they position them as. So then Khan will be incentivized to do what he does as well on the flip side, right? In that scenario, there will never be a position where, you know, you have a government that makes those tough choices, and you and I are talking about, loses political capital, and the political players in the game basically say, you know what, we're going to keep agitating in parliament and in the assemblies and wherever, criticize you however we can and try to win elections, but we're not going to undermine your rule by colluding with APARA or colluding with GHQ or trying to take you to the Supreme Court and drag you through and destabilize your government, right? That is not going to be the incentive. And so the incentive structure is less about, and also let's add another layer to this, is that this is an elite Game of Thrones. So they don't get impacted by 35% inflation or 35% depreciation of the rupee, right? The ordinary citizen does, but the ordinary citizen is not like these people, right? So they can afford to play this game because they're dollarized, they have assets abroad, they live in Banigala or fancy houses, drive around in Land Cruisers, or get Malik Riaz's jet to take them to Islamabad for an oath-taking ceremony, right? So they don't feel that pain. So again, it's an incentive disconnect and mismatch, which if that is the situation, the thing I'm thinking about is like, well, you'll never have that stability or that minimum reform agenda being carried out, because the incentive, it's a prisoner's dilemma. The incentive will always be to destroy the legitimacy of whoever is doing that. And I think that's where we are. And that needs a political compact. It's not a minimum economic agenda compact.
Okay, so the political compact, do you see that happening either? Do you see Imran Khan and Shahbaz Sharif meeting with Asif Ali Zardari and Bilawal Bhutto sitting at one table? Can you visualize it?
No, I don't think so.
I certainly can't because it was clear that there was an opportunity after 2018. And to be fair to the national unity government of the parties that are part of it, they did offer that kind of sort of, a kind of a sort of, what would they call it? I'm missing out on words here, but I remember Shahbaz Sharif and Asif Ali Zardari said, let's agree not to sort of mess with the economy at this point. And they said that in the floor of the House in Parliament. But Imran Khan, he has authoritarian tendencies and has a very, very little regard for Parliament or parliamentary process, wanted to sort of crush opponents. And that's the way he plays. And it succeeds when he's in opposition. It doesn't work so well when you're in government. So minimum economic agenda without political compromise, we don't see that happening. But I think what you're missing is another sort of key. Does any government in Pakistan, does any prime minister have any guarantee that it will complete his or her term or complete term for 5 years? So you're going to go for short-term populist measures. Remember what this current finance minister, who was finance minister in 2018 as well, Mifta Ismail, he obviously had a very sort of populist kind of election kind of budget as well. Well, if you look at Imran Khan, withdrew petrol subsidies as soon as he knew his government was under threat. So I think we can also agree that until all these sort of key institutions play their constitutional role, I wouldn't say that it would guarantee political stability, but at least you would give back some sense of the power of the vote to people, because they get to elect and they get to withdraw their favor or support. Right now, it's all about who the establishment is patronizing or withdrawing patronage from. At the moment, for instance, I'll give you an example. In Islamabad, some of the talk from the current sort of national unity government is that, we just wanted a level playing field. So we didn't ask you to support us the way you supported Imran Khan. And honestly speaking, nobody's made amends for it or talked about it openly, including I would say that the current dispensation also has an opportunity to sort of talk about that much more openly, but they haven't. Anyway, but we just want a level playing field. We don't want that same kind of support. It'll give us a free hand at least, which I don't think, I would say that right now it's really so. No government in Pakistan, no political government in Pakistan has a free hand because of patronage, and therefore resort to short-term populist measures, because 5 years down the line, we're not going to be voted in because of performance. We're going to be kicked out in one way or one form or the other, or undermined because we fell out of favor.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I would, to your patronage point, I would add that this patronage also is the structural problem with the broader economy as well, right? So if you talk about the types of changes that are needed, for example, let's just look at one thing. 23% of Pakistan's GDP roughly is agriculture. Agriculture contributes 0.1% in taxes. Now, if the thing we're talking about, which is how do you rescue this economy sustainably, needs to be solved, you have to tax the heck out of that sector. Patronage works in a way that even if the military and the judiciary say we're staying out of this, go rule, the prime minister may lose all sorts of friends in parliament and in the assemblies because they would have to start paying taxes. Does that stabilize or destabilize the government? For sure, destabilizes the government, right? So that's one element. Let's add another element. Let's assume the military says we're staying out, and the next chief says, don't come to me for these issues. Well, if the prime minister then says, announces with his finance minister that we're going to reform the economy such that the real estate sector does not become what is no longer what it is. Well, the DHA is one of the biggest players in the real estate market.
Yeah.
What does the chief do when his corps commanders and his retired people are coming at him saying, hey, these guys are demanding taxes, which means we have to sell our cushy plots at a loss, and I don't want to do that. What happens then, right? So it's these layers of issues, because it's a kleptocracy, something I've talked to so many people about on this podcast. And if that's the case, then even that modicum of stability that you just elaborated on, even if that pipe dream is achieved, there are more issues that will come to the surface after that, right? So yes, I agree. Free and fair elections are what's needed. It's a long, drawn out process. And the only way to achieve that process, to start off this process, is for institutions and the men, and it's all men who lead these institutions, to just take a chill pill and do what their job is and ignore everything else. Like, it's not the business of the military establishment to signal whether they are or aren't neutral. Just go defend the country and do your job. The Supreme Court has a backlog of cases. The judiciary needs reform. The Chief Justice should focus on that, not on dam funds or reinterpreting Article 63A or whatever else he pleases. And I think that's the starting point, right? But I don't see the incentives for that happening, because it is fun for them to do these kinds of things that they're not supposed to do in the first place.
I mean, absolutely. The patronage politics plays out at various levels. And who has the most power, who has the most patronage to dole out? Obviously, would be institutions that remain. I would say that that's why the broad term has been establishment, right? So it doesn't matter which army chief comes and goes. Chief justices have a lot of power within the domain as well. They get a lot of perks and privileges as well. So there's been a lot of talk about, for instance, there was a story about how certain executive privileges are being given to bureaucrats as well. But the point that I'm trying to make, and I think I want to go back to that. We were talking about political legitimacy, which you will only get with free and fair elections. We've talked about sort of how that could happen and then ruled it out as something that's unlikely to happen. But here's the thing, and you mentioned this and everybody's talking about it. Free and fair elections are absolutely key, but economic stability may be sort of in the short term, maybe a greater priority at this point in time. And political legitimacy or a free and fair election is not going to guarantee the kind of political stability that you need for economic stability. And that's another unfortunate reality for which, I wish I had a sort of more positive outlook at the moment. I don't see that happening.
No, I agree. And I think this is my last question to you. And I'll start with a comment and then ask this of you as well.
Mm,
Another thing that when I talk to especially elites in Pakistan, and I tell them, look, the time is running out, like on the economic front. You don't have a lot of
mm,
great options anymore, and you need to do something to rescue the situation. Their immediate responses, the last response is, well, we're Pakistan, we're a nuclear armed country, people will bail us out because we're too big of a problem otherwise. And my view has been the world has changed. It's an increasingly multipolar world. Even the Saudis and the Emiratis are looking for ROI. They're looking for what do
mm.
you offer in return. The Chinese are sort of in their own mess with zero COVID and real estate problems and all of that. But they're also sick and tired. They gave you $40 billion and now you want more. Like, come on, right? So the world has changed, and I think the playbook of Pakistani elites has not. And I think that's another major blind spot that they have, because from what I'm hearing from sitting here in DC, when I talk to people who look at the Middle East, who look at China or East Asia or India,
Mm.
they all are of the view that that old playbook of great power politics is no longer going to work, especially among the traditional allies Pakistan has had,
Mm.
because they've seen through it. They've been through these cycles before, and the world has shifted. And and I don't see that recognition sort of being internalized in Islamabad either. I don't know if you're
Mm.
sort of seeing this evolution of perspective, but I think
Mm.
that again is a big dangerous blind spot that they have, thinking that, oh, they will bail us out and we don't need to restructure our own economy because they've historically bailed us out.
I think the closest analogy to that, Uzair, would actually be the city of Karachi, where I'm sitting in, which has been neglected, which has been treated very poorly for decades by many governments, whether it's local governments or whether it's been by the provincial government, as well as the federal government as well, promising bailout packages or packages, and nothing has been done. And then when you have clearly what is extreme weather, which is the rains or this particular monsoon, and then the monsoon in 2020, which is battering infrastructure, which is really, I mean, it's causing billions of rupees of loss and damage, as well as a loss of life as well. And you can see that this is decades of neglect, and the climate change as well as rains. It's gonna keep coming back to haunt us, and we don't have enough time to not just repair but prepare ourselves for the next disaster. So I think it's pretty much the same. I think it's a great analogy, given that Karachi is supposed to be a sort of microcosm of Pakistan. It's a great analogy for Pakistan as well, where, as you pointed out, this whole concept of a bailout, friendly countries, some global event that could potentially mean that Pakistan is important again because of our strategic geolocation. It's not going to happen. I think, for instance, I'm just going to give you another example in terms of energy. I think energy economics is going to sort of also, post Russia, Ukraine, gas and petrol and coal and whatnot, is actually also shaping foreign policy as well. So, for instance, Venezuela and the US coming together despite being, being at odds with one another because of the opportunity given the Russia-Ukraine war as well. You've seen Iran as well. So I would say that Pakistan really needs to grip on how international politics is changing and our place in it and what we could potentially offer. Right now, we are, sure, we're a nuclear armed country, but India, for instance, is still a stronger economy. You see that the Saudis, for instance, and Biden himself, who talked about Khashoggi and human rights, going to Saudi Arabia because he needed to, because of obviously the energy crisis. So, I mean, that's a reality. What can Pakistan offer? At the moment, as a small country that's obviously constantly in debt and constantly its bailout packages, maybe nuclear armed, but really the threat isn't from its, nuclear arms. Because I remember that was the specter that was also raised as well a lot, where, oh, what if the militant organizations take over Pakistan's nuclear facilities? I don't think that's really a question that gets asked anymore. So Pakistan, given its dire economic conditions at the moment, where we don't see reforms in the horizon, I think we really need to think about what Pakistan has to offer. And there was a push towards geoeconomics. The army chief, General Qamar Bajwa, talked about it. There's a lot of talk about geoeconomics within Islamabad think tanks as well. But then, that was 2 years ago, and here we are, still struggling, and geoeconomics is nowhere in sight. We're curtailing. We have to, we're not in a position to export more at the moment, given that we're also struggling in terms of the energy crisis, supplying energy to industries, as well as spurring sort of more export-oriented, for which we also need imports as well, because we don't make a lot. We also have to import wheat. That's what one of the several years on after the Imran Khan government imported wheat, and there was obviously an inquiry report as well. We're still importing wheat. We're actually, and this is interesting, where we may be importing wheat from Russia, where it was from Ukraine as well. So the point here is that what do we have to offer? We really need to rethink this, and how do we get there? Given that the current political crises, given the appointment of the army chief and continuity of policy seems really sort of far off on the horizon, I don't think anybody's in a position to think about that, even if some of them, let's not dismiss everybody in Islamabad at the moment, but, even if somebody was.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's really the tragedy, and we can end on this tragic note, is that if you have people fighting over who gets to rule for how long and what the rules are going to be that will allow them to stay in power, if that's the agenda that everyone's focused on, then all of the things you and I just talked about over the last 20, 30 minutes that are important, more fundamental issues Pakistan faces, they fall by the wayside, right? And the answer typically is, if you're Imran Khan, ek imandar shakhs upar ho, to sab theek ho jayega, we'll go back to that, or corruption is the biggest problem. Or if you're, frankly, the PML-N, if you're somebody like Mr. Ismail, hum aayenge to hum power ki prices kam kar denge. It's like, bhaijan, circular debt hai. You can't raise the tariffs, right? You can't do that. So you talk in like these broad terms as part of your strategy to, again, blind the people, and then expect that they will be okay when you tell them, I have eyesight and I have to make these tough decisions. You get destroyed the way the PML-N did in Punjab recently. And I think that's my biggest fear, is that there is a confluence of crises that are striking at Pakistan, including climate change, which is impacting wheat, as you mentioned, including the emergence of a multipolar world, including friendly countries saying they're looking elsewhere and they're recalibrating their relationships. And I think Pakistan's elites, its sort of kleptocratic establishment, so to speak, is stuck in this warped view of their own sense of importance, right, to the world. And I think they need a reality check, and maybe it takes a default for that reality check to happen. I would be devastated if it comes to that type of crisis in Pakistan, because we don't want a Lebanon or a Sri Lanka happening. But when I talk to these elites, the way they react to these points that we've been raising and questioning, they don't seem to grasp even the importance. At least you and I do grasp the importance. And a lot of people I speak with who listen to the podcast, who comment, understand the scale and nature of this crisis. But those at the helm of affairs, I don't think they do. So we'll muddle along and we'll see where we end up.
I mean, I want to point out that Pakistan is going to celebrate its 75th independence in August, and August being key in terms of where politics will go as well. And we're still talking about the rules of the game in terms of politics and who plays what role. It's all in the Constitution. Nobody needs to reinvent the wheel. It's written down. It's not even an unwritten verbal constitution such as the UK. It's all down there. But here we are, where politics is clearly broken and on two sort of extremes. And the economy is also pretty broken as far as I'm concerned, and it doesn't seem to be a sort of think about a long-term fix.
No, I agree. And so we'll see where things go and whether we have some semblance of free and fair elections and some sort of end to this political saga. I know you're tired of this. I am tired of this, but I'm sure the audience is tired of this. But I don't see it ending anytime soon. And I think you will agree. And on that note, we will end and maybe have you another 6 months time when elections are done and see whether we were on point or not in the fact that, the saga will continue and it's like a long drawn out trilogy that is not ending anytime soon. So Amber, thank you so much for taking out the time again and for sharing your insights and analysis with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And on that note, I'd say, if we're going to use a Game of Thrones analogy, which you did, yeah, so George R.R. Martin hasn't written the last few books that he needs to write. And yeah, that's Pakistan.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.